Hey, everybody, this is Jason Wilson with the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. So today I'm joined with Murphy Murri, a fellow cannabis educator and also a cannabis extraction consultant. And today we're going to be talking all about, well, we'll see what we get into, but primarily cannabis extraction. Thanks so much, Murphy, for being willing to come on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really stoked. Our paths hadn't crossed before now, so this has kind of been long awaited for me as far as I've followed some of your work and seen your classes like from a distance. So it's cool to finally connect and talk about common interests. For those that aren't familiar with some of your work and because your background's kind of diverse, do you mind kind of sharing just a little bit about some of that background and what led you into getting into specifically like the cannabis chemistry and extraction and all of the work that you're kind of focusing on now?
Yeah, sure. I started in the cannabis industry when it was fledgling in Colorado. So we had the caregiver structure in 2009, and we started seeing retail dispensaries open up, but there wasn't licensing for it, and it still kind of mimicked what California has going on at the time in a lot of ways. And so, I got involved on the retail end. I lived in the Vail Valley, and we wanted to sell high-end cannabis products to those high-end medical patients. And in 2010, licensing started, and in Colorado, that meant vertical integration. So being from a marketing background and working on the retail side of things, I had no preparation for an extraction lab and certainly no preparation for large-scale cultivation. And so it was all just something that was kind of thrown at us, and we had to get involved. I did my best to delegate where I could, but the lab was one of the hardest ones to delegate out because there, a lot of people had grown for decades.
Yeah.
But there wasn't much for extraction historically. Like a lot of people were doing bubble hash, but that is not even, in the same department, especially at the time. We were just starting to see things like amber glass, which was like a shatter made from ethanol, you know, and we were starting to see the butane honey oil, and we were still really just calling it honey oil at the time and not even really referencing how it was being made because everything was still a big secret for a really long time, which is part of the reason why education is so important to me, because the first 3 to 4 years of my cannabis career, especially in the extraction world, there was nowhere to get good information. Yeah. There was a couple of hard to navigate forums with a lot of code words and screen names. And it was really difficult to use that information in a practical way. And not having that chemistry background, was certainly a disadvantage. But at that time, we weren't doing chemistry. We were barely extracting, material. We were leaving a lot of cannabinoids behind. Yeah. We were not purifying anything, and we had no analytical testing to support it. So, the concentrates that we made, we had no potency data on. We had no pesticide data. We had no heavy metal testing. I couldn't tell you how many milligrams of THC or anything else. It was all anecdotal. It was all descriptive. And, I look back at that and just get anxious about all of the products that I made and sold that I wouldn't do today because we just didn't have the tools. Yeah. So, fast forward a few more years, and the internet makes things a lot easier. 10 years is a long time in terms of internet development. And so more information became accessible, which is good and bad. A lot of bad information became accessible, but what is more relevant is that we have the social media aspect of it. And so now I could actually network with real humans. And as more states became legalized, people were less afraid to actually share what they were doing. And real consultant jobs started becoming a thing. And so we started to talk a lot more and develop methods. And that's where I kind of got into the extraction space, in a very much more serious way, because we started to actually have real standards to pursue. And I had started to meet the type of people who were doing things that I wanted to emulate. And from there, I got involved on the equipment end of things in 2004 2014, I started working for Extraction Tech Solutions, which was one of the only hydrocarbon equipment manufacturers at the time. And I started doing private consulting. From there, I just became fully immersed in the world of extraction. So from, just straight up cannabis extraction to also the burgeoning hemp industry.
Yeah.
And, we've just kind of gone all the way from black oil to white powder
Right.
in, the last few years.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to kind of see that laid out on an image timeline.
My Facebook memories can be scary sometimes. I don't know.
What is it that particularly about extraction now that's really driving your passion to kind of continue that focus in that arm of things?
I think one of my favorite things about extraction has always been that, it's very objective. Once we started bringing analytical testing into it and started actually doing chemistry in the labs, it was really rewarding because I could perform a process, I could get results, and I could repeat those results. Yeah. And compare that to like cultivation, where every step you take today, you see the results of that weeks, months ahead of, that point. So there's no instant gratification in cultivation, whereas extraction is instant gratification. Every 30 minutes, I get to see the results of what I've achieved. And so it feels very productive. Yeah. And it also gives me a lot of room for error, which is very exciting for me because I love the experimentation of it. Yeah. With cultivation, even just having a table that you try out new nutrients on can affect literally the rest of the garden. Whereas with extraction, I can have a new idea. I can try a new piece of equipment. I can tweak a process. I can make these changes, minute to minute, day to day, and get to evaluate the efficiency. And so the potential for growth is just phenomenal because it's exponential. Every single day I can try something new, and every new test result gives me 10 more questions to go chase down the rabbit hole. So it is constant change and very fast moving, which I find personally rewarding. I'm the type of person that rearranges my furniture often. I love change. Yep. And extraction is nothing but change.
Yeah, I could see that. It'd be really exciting to be caught up in that accelerated process of refinement of technologies and process and everything. You really get to see it unfold in a way that's unique. When you were learning about extraction, what were some of the resources that you found most valuable to kind of understand what you needed to do to take things to that next level? I know Skunk Farm is obviously one resource that we all probably know pretty well. That's a huge one. But what were some others that you found valuable?
I mean, those online forums were enormous, but through those online forums, I actually got to meet really competent people. Yeah. And I think both 10 years ago and even today, the mentorship from finding someone smarter and better than you is the most valuable. Like, I look back on my career to some specific individuals who brought me in and were willing to, share what at the time was like trade secrets, like the things that we just didn't discuss out loud, in part because it was illegal, but also in part, to keep our brands, unique. And those people were enormous for me. I had a couple of chemists who were involved early on that were really helpful in explaining some of like the basic safety issues that I would never have even thought to ask questions about, probably without their help. Not to mention just some, industry pioneers, people like Nick Tannum of Essential Extracts, who, was willing to teach me how to make bubble hash in his kitchen and, get me involved in this industry when it was still barely an industry. We were barely for profit at the time.
Right.
So.
Yeah. That's, I think that's really, really good advice to anybody listening that's trying to figure out how to kind of break into the space. I've always been a fan of mentorship too. That's how I've gotten to where I am as well. It's like I can think of like really 3 key people that, I just happened to sort of serendipitously come across that felt comfortable and taught me things or gave me chances that all of a sudden, progress into things you can't imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all learn that way. there's this common misconception in cannabis that like you've just got to be good at it. That
Right.
like some of us are just gonna like stumble into a garden, get gifted the right clone, and the rest of it's gravy, you know,
Yeah.
or like there's some kind of magic secret to it. But really, like I've got one math teacher who made algebra click for me. Like
Yeah.
I remember two English teachers that, you know, made an impact on my love of literature or my language today. Most of the time, like we need someone else to help us, you know,
Yeah.
cultivate our passion. And I think that's really valuable. You know, for example, the person who started my extraction career, you know, Nicholas Tannum, he works in a completely different section of the industry now. You know, like learning under him, you know, kind of gave me the insight that I needed to know where I wanted to go and that it was different,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
like, you know, these kinds of lessons are something that I wouldn't have learned if I didn't get that exposure early on. And, you know, that's as an educator, that's one thing that I see most in students is that people think that it's supposed to come easily.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, if you're going to learn something, you need a teacher, and
Right.
that's perfectly okay, you know? So seek out a mentor that you can have those open conversations with. It's so enormously helpful. Like the
Yeah.
internet is still just talking to a wall a lot of times.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
You know, like
Absolutely.
Google is too much information. If I ask my friend what to Google, they're going to give me better search words.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And a big part of the role of a mentor is sort of helping you craft perspective. And so,
right.
you know, when you work with someone like that that's knowledgeable, you walk away seeing things just totally different. And so you recognize different opportunities that you would have never seen before, or recognized where you fit, I guess, you know,
Yeah,
into a grander scheme of things. That can be really,
absolutely.
really valuable. Yeah. What sort of extraction technologies did you work with along the way? You've mentioned a couple, but I know, isn't your focus now primarily on liquid hydrocarbons? Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. So my focus since about 2011 has been, you know, exclusively butane and propane. Part of that comes from the trends in the industry. You know, most of the
Mm-hmm.
smokable products on the shelves are originating from butane and propane because it's one of the few methods of extraction that allows us to preserve the acid form of our cannabinoids, the
Yeah. Yep.
non-decarboxylated products, which I think you're going to hear a lot more about in terms
Mm-hmm.
of, you know, medical applications over the next year here. So I've been, you know, predominantly focused on that. However, the development of the hemp industry called for larger scale than butane and propane is currently poised to accommodate. So I had to come back to ethanol
Mm-hmm.
extraction in a much more sophisticated way than the ethanol extraction that I started with, you know, many years ago. So, you know, while I got into it with, you know, the most accessible stuff, you know, just straight up bubble bags and water hash,
Mm-hmm.
I've been on the combustible solvent end of things for most of my cannabis career.
Yeah. And one of the, I guess, issues that people usually raise with hydrocarbons is the safety issue. So, and you mentioned earlier that
Yep.
that was a big part of your learning, is trying to figure out how to do a lot of this work safely. So, what are
Yeah.
some of those key safety issues that you have to be aware of working in that environment, and what do you do to mitigate those?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing that I've got to bring up is, you know, that we have to respect the chemical solvents that we
Right.
use,
Yeah.
and I think that one thing most people getting into the industry don't take the time to value and appreciate is just reading a simple MSDS sheet.
Yep.
You know, reading the warnings literally on the labels of the
Yeah.
products that we use. Because a lot of times a person shows us how to do something and then we just try to repeat their process
Yeah.
and we don't try to even give ourselves the whole picture. You know, it's kind of like when you learn to drive a car, like someone teaches you how to, you know, hit the gas and hit the
Mm-hmm.
brake, but you don't necessarily learn how the engine works.
Right.
If you did understand how the engine works, you'd be a better driver.
Yeah.
But a lot of times we leave that first part of the puzzle out and we just teach everyone to be operators, which is not quite enough information. I'm one of the few people that I have met with the number of years of experience that I do in extraction that didn't start with open blasting these solvents. I
Yeah.
always operated within a closed system. It never occurred to me to get involved in open blasting, because the first thing I understood about my solvent was that it was highly combustible. And so I needed to protect myself from it.
Right.
And so my career has always been, on that equipment side and that technology side, because it just came to me as a given. The people who first introduced me to solvent-based extraction showed me CO2 extractors and, closed ethanol systems. And so it just never occurred to me to go any other route. I started right out with that understanding of like, every new solvent, you need to read what it says, because some solvents are poisonous and make you die, and some solvents are just flammable, and so then they're dangerous, and some things are inert and not a big deal. And understanding the difference between them is your life.
Right. Yeah, I know. That's the issue of needing to read the safety data sheets is something that's come up in multiple ways in my world, because on the extraction world and also in the product manufacturing world, just for trying to understand the safety of ingredients that are going into cannabis products. So there's been, I don't know, I've seen multiple examples on Instagram where someone will actually post a safety data sheet and claim that, like, look how safe this is because it's grass. And then you look at the intended uses and it's like topical application, like maybe hasn't even been studied, to be consumed or inhaled or something like that. So I think that's a really good recommendation to start, is actually read your safety data sheets for your materials you're handling. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's the most accessible information in the world. And so without it, you're absolutely at a disadvantage just from day one. One thing that I always recommend, even with like cleaning products or dry materials, is that you've got to pay attention, to like the cleanup procedures, to the waste procedures. One thing a lot of gardens are very guilty of is improper waste disposal, and nobody talks about it because no one read the information that said this is really harmful to just dispose of and put down the drain.
Yeah.
So
so much that's dangerous to aquatic wildlife.
Right.
You lose the biodiversity of life in a river stream, then you're destroying the quality of your water overall.
No, absolutely. And in the same way as that, paying attention to what you put into your waste when you're growing can actually help you make better decisions with regards to what you put into your plants. We can have that same perspective on efficiencies in the lab if we pay attention to the waste disposal, because paying attention to that waste is actually what inspires the equipment manufacturers to invest in better solvent recovery.
Right.
It's all about, on one hand, keeping yourself safe, but on the other hand, being a good steward of the planet, and finding, a commercial or industrial application that doesn't just save you money, doesn't just keep people safe, but actually, reduces harm across the board.
Yeah. Yeah. And how would you describe, given that you've kind of been around all of these different extraction types, how would you briefly summarize some of the pros and cons to those different extraction methods? Like, what's sort of driving those decisions of why people are choosing one over the other, CO2 over hydrocarbons or over ethanol?
Sure. So the first question that everyone has to ask themselves is, what do you want to make?
Yeah.
Your end product is really important. And a really quick and easy way to simplify that is, does your final product need to have the original terpene and flavor profile from the plant? Yes or no? And, a yes to that answer means that you're looking at CO2 or liquid hydrocarbons. If it's a no, then you can look at CO2, liquid hydrocarbons, or potentially ethanol or heptane or, some of these other products. The other question you have to ask yourself is, what type of cannabinoids are you looking for? Do you need the acid form? Do you need those, crystalline solids? Or are you looking for a decarboxylated product? Because certain extraction methods are also more likely to give you one or the other. And so those two questions will usually shorten your list right away. And so from there, ethanol is one of the best solvents suited for scale currently. And the reason for that is that so much ethanol extraction already exists in other industries. It's considered food safe.
Yeah.
And so there are, regulations and equipment in place that we can just straight up copy and put into effect for cannabis. However, the boiling temperature for ethanol and its interactions with water are really problematic, especially depending on the qualities of your inputs. And so you lose terpene content almost no matter what. And you are also at risk for some degradation and some pH issues, extraction of undesirable compounds like sugars. And so there's a lot of things to consider that are going to lead you to, first of all, a decarboxylated product, but also more than likely an isolated product. It's going to be harder for you to have a clean oil that doesn't call for a lot of post-processing and cleanup.
Yeah. That seems like a maybe that's like a misconception in some circles, that you would actually have like a wider diversity of some of these compounds in an ethanol extract or even a CO2 extract. But that's something I've run into in my own experience, working in some of these labs and seeing, like for CO2, a lot of times the material is decarboxylated before it ever, goes into the extractor. Right. And so obviously doing that process, you're losing terpenes, anything volatile, you're losing a lot of volatiles, especially those really lightweight ones. And then with ethanol, before I really got involved in some of this work, I didn't realize how much refinement went into ethanol extracts to clean them up.
Right.
And now I've learned a lot of that pathway leads to just making distillates or isolates.
Exactly.
So it's fascinating, because before I got experience in some of this, I had heard, I don't know, just people speaking very generally that, well, of course, your ethanol extracts are going to have more phytochemical diversity in them, or with CO2, that you can target these fractions. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but everything comes at a cost with each of these technologies.
Right. And so, the drawbacks are, definitely very chemical. But the benefit is that if you want to process 5,000 pounds or more per day of raw material, ethanol is your current best option. However, that 5,000 pounds that you extracted that day isn't ready for sale that day.
Right.
It's still in solution, most likely.
It's a big tincture.
Exactly. So, there's still more days in that final product production end. If we look at CO2 is a very complicated product because CO2 is a flexible solvent. It relies completely on the operator and the equipment having a plan and sticking to it. And so CO2 is capable of being an excellent solvent for terpene extraction. It's also capable of extracting a lot of water and wax and nonsense, just depending on, how that equipment is used and how efficient that process is. A lot of people decarboxylate their material, like you mentioned, to avoid the water issues, which means sacrificing terpene content, which is a bummer because CO2 is capable of doing probably one of the best jobs with terpenes as far as solvent extraction would go. But, it comes generally with the cost of still requiring winterization in ethanol. So I tend to put CO2 and ethanol together because whether you make your crude with ethanol or you make it with CO2, you probably are going to be following the post-processing path. That's the same either way, which would be that winterization and filtration, and then probably, most likely, distillation.
Right. Yeah.
And the exception to not going to distillate is usually still just to be in that raw oil form. So maybe you might not distill, but it's still only available for pens or for, food. It's still not, it's still a limited product as far as what you can do with it.
Yeah.
And so hydrocarbon is a lot more flexible in that regard because while it is a very small input batch size, we're doing, 500 pounds or less per day in the average lab, which is not massive scale. We're not going to feed the world with that. However, I don't have any of that week-long post-processing that follows it up. So while I might only get to process 500 pounds that day, I could sell the oil that I made that day the next day. Yeah. Which is, a big difference. And it's something that, we often skip when we look at our production plans is, how many like we think about how much can this equipment do,
Right.
Per pound, per
Yep.
hour, whatever. But we have to bring it all the way back and say, okay, well, all of this equipment in a straight line is going to take how long from raw material to packaged in for sale?
Exactly.
And hydrocarbon is absolutely the fastest for that. Butane and propane evaporate at very low temperatures, which means we get the acid form, which means I can go to Delta 9. I can distill it. I can make a tincture.
Right.
I can make edibles, or I can make all of these other things that I can't do as easily or as quickly with CO2 or ethanol.
Yeah.
So that that post-processing flexibility is the primary advantage there. It is, however, combustible.
Yeah.
And so, with ethanol, we have the flammable issue. And with CO2, we have the high pressure issue. With the liquid hydrocarbons, we have both.
Yeah.
So, the risks are significant, and the risks are only mitigated via equipment and safe workspace. There's no safe way to just be careful,
Yeah.
And statistically speaking, for everyone who is going to listen to this and think, well, I've been doing it for years. Statistically speaking, the more days you've gotten away with it, the closer you are getting to the day when you won't. It will come. And so, the safety risks are significant because it is combustible in nature.
Yeah.
However, it is a clean extraction method. Butane and propane don't dissolve mold. They can't carry over, water as easily. So the final product, because it's very easy to remove the solvent, and the solvents are food safe, and our exposure to them is generally non-toxic. They're very safe products. Whereas with ethanol, high levels of residual ethanol can certainly be harmful, especially for oral ingestion. And, that high level of water content in a lot of CO2 products can lead to microbial growth. And so we have, some pros and cons both on the processing side as well as for the actual consumer. Because if I need a product that can store for a very long time with limited degradation, a hydrocarbon extracted product probably has a better shelf life than an ethanol extracted product or a CO2 extracted product based on literally just their moisture content.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a excellent summary. And I think something that consumers take for granted is that things like microorganisms can grow on extracts in certain environments. I've definitely seen it. I mean, working in the testing lab, I'll never forget the first time I saw it was essentially a moldy CO2 extract. I'd never come across that before, but now I realize it's less common now that people have kind of learned more, how to do their processes better. But that was something that was a shock to me, and I'm sure is a shock to some people listening that haven't encountered that before. And I'm glad you touched on the issue around the safety of the solvents, because that was going to be something I was going to ask you is some people, when they're first learning about extracts, they feel put off by the hydrocarbon extracts because they feel like there's a higher safety risk due to the solvent load in there. So do you have any advice you could offer listeners that if they're worried about solvents in a product, what sort of levels should they sort of be looking for? What's typical ideally in a well-purged extract, you maybe wouldn't have anything detectable or very, very low parts per billion. But what are your thoughts on that if someone asked you, what's a safe exposure level?
So the first thing that everyone should do is the first thing I mentioned in this interview. Go read the MSDS for the solvent that you're wondering about, first of all, because the health risks that are associated with it are going to be on that sheet, and it gives a range. So that gives you the acute exposure range, the moderate, or the persistent exposure. And you want to see what your best and worst case scenarios are. That acute exposure of 200 parts per million butane in your product is largely non-harmful. Just breathe fresh air. You're fine.
Right.
And that, day-to-day exposure of over 5,000 parts per million for 8 hours at a time or longer does lead to dizziness and, some other issues. And so you want to see the best and the worst. You want to see how much of this is it going to take for nausea versus pass out versus stroke and seizure.
Right.
Like you want to know what the actual ranges are, and that information is not a secret and it's not up for debate. Like for those solvents to exist and be used, that information has been studied. Now, it hasn't necessarily been studied for how hot of a dab you're going to take at home and how many grams you're going to smoke per day. These applications aren't necessarily standard, but our human exposure from inhalation or ingestion has been studied for these solvents to actually be sold and be legally allowed for us to use in extraction. Licensed labs can't use solvents that haven't been tested in that way.
Right.
So that data exists, and I would encourage everyone to go read it right away, because it's easy for us to all have opinions about the parts per million limit. And a lot of those are based on state regulations, which were formed from the opinions of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes they're pulled
specific criteria.
Yeah. Sometimes they're pulled from really weird places. Yeah.
Right. And so those numbers are not based on human studies. Those numbers are not based on, known and proven and, calculated potential harm. They're just numbers. They have, about as much data behind them as the safe speed limit for a road. Like maybe 35 is safe in your car, and maybe in my car 45 is safe, and maybe with my mom driving my car 45 isn't safe. Like maybe there's more variables than just that number. So it's hard to rely on that, because you're going to see a really wide range. And so the state of Massachusetts says 10 parts per billion is what's safe for butane. And, the state of Oregon says 5,000 parts per million is the safe amount. And, neither of them are in charge of how much is actually safe for you and your body. And so the numbers are a very difficult one to compare. Obviously, we want to remove as much of those, solvents as we possibly can. However, most of these solvents like butane, propane, CO2, and ethanol are food safe products. When we get into things like pentane and hexane and heptane, or some of the compounds that are being used for conversions like iodine or toluene, like we've got some more significant health risks. And so, and those actually are more common in like CBD products where there's no regulation. Scarier issue that we could get into later.
Yeah.
But, for the most part, you're going to have those solvents that are used listed on the label. And so you can do a quick MSDS check and read what the best and worst could possibly be. And then compare that to the parts per million. And, we can put that math together, and we can say, 5,000 parts per million for 8 hours a day of exposure to butane is what, the MSDS recommends as being dangerous enough to actually make you ill and make you dizzy. And so if you are smoking a product that has 5,000 parts per million in it, don't smoke it for 8 hours a day.
Right.
Because, like now we can start to at least say, okay, well, that's something that, a dab at a time might add up to that acute exposure of, however many parts per million. Every time we flick our lighter, that's about, 5,000 parts per million briefly. And so we're being exposed to butane and propane. It's in your air. CO2 is in your air. Ethanol is in almost every flavored food product you eat.
Yeah.
So like anything that has artificial colors probably contains ethanol, so like a lot of these solvents exist. It's not realistic to fear them. And it is really important to judge them with math.
Yeah.
Like you've got to pay attention to how much is there. There's a big difference between 20,000 parts per million of butane and, 20.
Right.
And so you want to pay attention to those numbers as best you can. But I would also encourage anyone, especially anyone who's smoking concentrates, to listen to their body, because the solvents themselves are known, are studied, and are tested for. What we cannot provide to people right now is a comprehensive look at the potential conversions that are happening. the byproducts of some of this exposure.
Yeah.
Just heating up a solution that's extremely, high pH in ethanol that contains a lot of water could create some, converted byproducts that become really dangerous.
Yep.
Using iodine for conversions is, efficient to a certain extent, but it creates a bond with cannabinoids that isn't tested for. And now we have a cannabinoid compound that has been bonded with a little bit of iodine, and that can get to your brain, and that could probably end your life. We don't know, but that's not something that would be tested for.
Right.
And so the risks around these solvents, are the greater concern. And since we can't necessarily apply a lot of data to that right now, listen to your body. If it hurts to smoke, stop it.
Yeah. No,
if it's uncomfortable, if it makes you feel weird, don't keep doing it. There are so many options out there that you should, listen to, the cues that your own physical chemistry is giving you. For the most part, like our instincts are generally right. And, even terpenes can degrade to benzene.
Yep.
So, our favorite parts of cannabis could kill us.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've got to, be as educated as you can about the solvents. You don't have to know everything about extraction, but in the same way that you would look up a hormone that's added to your milk, you could look up a solvent that's used in your extraction, and then just pay attention to what your body tells you.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. You don't have to know everything, but you should at least have the skill of knowing how to find the information when the time comes, if you need to look that up. Yeah. Well, shifting gears a little bit away from the safety side and talking about the products, one thing I wanted to ask, because it's something that I hear a question about a lot related to extraction. What affects the various, I guess we'll say, consistencies of hydrocarbon-based extracts? Because it's well known that there's a wide variety of sort of types of hydrocarbon extracts.
Yeah.
And so can you speak a little bit to some of the dynamics that influence those final products?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the reasons that hydrocarbon products have that, wide range in texture and consistency is because they have the potential to extract the acid form. And for a lot of cannabinoids, the acid form and the decarboxylated form of that cannabinoid have different physical states. So for example, THCA is, a solid, colorless, crystalline product at room temperature, whereas, Delta 9 THC is, a colorless liquid at room temperature. And so that's a big difference in consistency. So if my concentrate is mostly THC Delta 9, I'm going to get sticky liquid because Delta 9 is a sticky liquid. But if I've got mostly THCA, I am going to have a primarily dry solid. And so, that first differentiation in ratio of, THC versus THCA or, CBD versus, THC makes a big difference in, just the potential consistency that I've got in front of me, especially because I don't want to say decarboxylation can't be reversed, but generally we're not going back from that. So once we have crossed into that decarboxylated state, once I've got CBD, I've got a solid. Once I've got Delta 9, I've got a liquid. And so the hydrocarbon extraction process allows us to play with that texture a little bit more because we can start with a dry product and go liquid or not. Yeah. So that already makes a big difference. It's just the dominant compound in any given solution is going to dictate, the structure that it takes on. Then from there, we have, the other minor groups that are involved. Now, hydrocarbon extraction is also excellent for terpene extraction because it happens at low temperature, so we don't destroy them, and they're soluble, in butane and propane, so we're able to capture a lot of them. We also have the added benefit through hydrocarbon extraction of being able to extract wet or fresh frozen material because it doesn't take on water content in the same way that 5,000 psi worth of CO2 or any given amount of ethanol will. So we have, the potential to not only extract more terpenes because they're compatible solvents, but also because we can capture terpenes from the plant material before it has dried out, before those have changed, before those have evaporated. And so that terpene content is mostly liquid. Some terpenes are solid at room temperature, but mostly we're dealing with liquids. And so the amount of terpene content in any given hydrocarbon extracted product has a huge impact on that liquid versus solid situation, because those terpenes can dissolve that solid cannabinoid.
Yeah.
And so why we might have 90%, solid THCA cannabinoid content, we might still have something that looks half liquidy, because those terpenes can actually dissolve quite a bit of it and keep it in solution. So, that recipe gives us a lot of options. And that's just based on what it contains, regardless of what I might do to it. If I just pour it out of my extractor and here it is. Then from there, because we have that acid form, because we have some of these solids, we have the potential for crystallization. Or, in the opposite route, we have the potential for, an emulsified or homogenized product. And so, shatter, wax, butter, those kinds of things are generally homogeneous products. Shatter is everything mixed up and, solid and flat, whereas the butter and the wax is everything whipped up and actually aerated. But in either case, basically the same original content, which is way more THCA than that liquid terpene content, which allows it to be, dry rather than wet. And then from there, it's just, how we play with it. It's at that point, it's kind of, how do you take your eggs? You like them scrambled, you want them sunny side up. So for me, I try to pay attention to that chemical content first, because it's a good indicator. If I really care about flavor, I probably don't want dry textured products, because inherently I'm going to have less.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And how does the material coming in affect some of that process? One of the things that I was going to ask you is, what it's like working. You mentioned fresh frozen, so like the difference between like different types of like live resin and cured resin, and these different attributes that relate to the flower material as it's coming in. What are some of the big differences there?
There are so many important qualities for your extracted product. I think one of the most obvious ones that a lot of people fail to pay attention to is surface area. When we look at big, pretty buds that, we're putting in a jar, we're selling on a shelf, we look at them like flowers, and we want them to have a nice clean cut. And we want, we have these very aesthetic, perceptions about what is good and what is bad. And that is super irrelevant to me for extraction. All I care about is resin content, and big dense buds have less of it by weight than little fluffy buds that aren't very dense, because the surface area is greater by weight on those products. And so, the type of material that you want to provide for extraction isn't these big, dense, rock solid nuggets. Those are annoying. Those take me time to break up. And it's literally more plant material versus resin. If I, grind up a big dense bud, homogenize it, and get an analytical test on that, I get totally different results than if I take the same amount of weight of small little fluffy buds, grind it up and homogenize it. They literally have more resin. And that's all that matters to me for extraction. However, where it grows on the plant certainly has an impact on the other chemical content that it's going to contain, especially terpene content that is produced generally to protect the plant from its local environment. And so it would only stand to reason that the buds on top are going to smell, and respond differently than the ones on the bottom, because they've got different jobs as far as that plant is concerned, and they've got different enemies. So, so there's definitely a really important role that just the actual harvested nug plays, not only in where it comes from on the plant, but the surface area, the density, and even the time of harvest. Every single day that you push that harvest, it produces different terpene content. It does, that terpene content doesn't store up the way that cannabinoid content
Yeah.
does. It doesn't accumulate. And so if you harvest on a day when it isn't smelling amazing, that's all I've got to work with,
Yeah.
you know? And if you harvest on a day when it smells outstanding and you freeze instantly, I can get that. I can get that back. I can preserve it. So, you know, the care that's taken during harvest is incredibly important for some of those volatile compounds. And I try to pay very close attention to that. And, you know, the people that we want to work with are people who are also going to care about that. It's difficult to get that kind of attention and care for your products if you're just, you know, massively harvesting everything on a 45 schedule, regardless of what's happening in the room. You know, and so sometimes that kind of massive factory approach to it is not ideal for some of the boutique flavors. However, if we're just trying to extract cannabinoid content, you know, well, we can get it from whatever you've got.
Right.
You know, there's still some other things to consider, like literally the density of the cuticle, you know, how much wax content that trichome contains. You know, if you've got really thick trichomes, I'm probably going to get lower yields from your material, not only because it probably just contains less resin, but also because the resin is going to be less accessible to me, because removing waxes
You're going to lose some of that
almost the same process as removing cannabinoids. And so it becomes more difficult to get, you know, or therefore at least less cost efficient to get a really clean yield. And so, you know, some of that chemical content is, you know, really valuable. And that's something that the people who work in like the rosin space are starting to pay a lot of attention to, because high wax content is, you know, one of the highest risks associated with their products. And it also contributes to their low yields. And so if they can identify that, you know, wax content while they're growing it, they could impact it, they could change it, they could improve on it and reduce it, and actually grow plants that could produce 5-6%, you know, yields on that rosin, which would change their business model completely.
Right. Entirely.
So, you know, so those things, you know, affect all of us, not just rosin. That's also something that's important for us with hydrocarbon extracted products. And so that quality is really important. The other thing I think that would be important to pay attention to is transparency. You know, we only know that it's free of the pesticides we test for. We only know that it's free of the mycotoxins that we test for at the time we tested it. You know, like a lot of that data is not quite complete. And so we have to be able to trust who we work with. And we all have to be open about that trust, because sometimes we don't know that we're doing something wrong. Sometimes, you know, sometimes it is leaving their facility clean and getting moldy in my, you know, fridge, like my freezer, fridge storage. So like, you know, we all have to be able to be open with each other and work together to resolve those issues. You know, like it's really difficult to do a good job if you don't have someone who's willing to be transparent, bring you into the garden, and, you know, involve you in that, you know, harvest process so that you can both make clean and sustainable products.
No, totally. I remember when I was working in the testing labs, how sad it was when, you know, a cultivator would end up with a testing result that they weren't expecting. You know, or kind of like what you're mentioning, like in a wholesale situation where the farmer sold it, it was good. When it went to the wholesaler, it sat at the wholesaler's facility for who knows how long. They retested it, and it comes back, and then they're trying to hunt down what happened, who's at fault, and sometimes there's a lot of money involved in, you know, some of these transactions. And sometimes it was devastating to see some of these farms that actually were putting in a lot of good energy trying to do things as best as possible, and then somewhere, you know, along the chain, things go wrong and they don't understand why, and sometimes couldn't figure it out, you know, what happened. Like somebody wouldn't fess up to some part of something, and sometimes it's really you know, things you wouldn't necessarily expect. One time I remember a guy had failed for pesticides and then realized that someone on his garden used a hose that was used on another farm, you know, that sprayed pesticides, and he just didn't keep track of, that hose. So yeah, it's a process that the industry's, learning all of these nuanced pieces of it,
Right.
because you can understand the high level of like, okay, I'm not going to use pesticides, I'm not going to do this, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then all these other factors come into play that you don't imagine.
Right. And it's easy to villainize, who's at fault
Right.
and say, like any failure is unacceptable,
Right.
but who's at fault is not as important as how to remediate it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like what's most important is figuring out what happened and why, so that it can't happen again,
Yep.
not so that we can dissolve our relationship and say
Yeah.
bad things about each other on the internet. Like the point is to move forward. We have all failed before.
Yep.
We have all done a bad job somewhere. Just because you've never failed a pesticide test doesn't mean you couldn't fail any pesticide test.
Right.
You've just never failed
Yeah.
the tests you've taken, and there's just so many ways that things can go wrong that we have to find people to work with that have the same ethics and morals and intentions as we do.
Yep.
So that we can work through them together. Like bad business deals are what sink otherwise strong, well-intended businesses. And a lot of that comes from this very like all in or all out kind of attitude that we tend to have, rather than working through it together to improve. These relationships should be long term.
Yeah.
And just because the industry is new doesn't mean we can't come at it with that kind of diplomacy and with a structure that allows us to prepare for things going wrong.
Right.
Because it does.
Yeah, we're human. Like, mistakes are gonna happen. Like, despite anyone's best effort, things are gonna go
Right.
wrong. And you're right. It's how you respond to that and how you move forward that really is most critical. And in general, what most of us want to see is for the industry as a whole to learn and figure out its problem areas and then address those, teach, as many people as we can to spread that knowledge, and then see the industry get, better and better. It's to see quality improve and safety improve, and
Absolutely.
everybody, mature along this industry together. So, but yeah, there's a lot of like, I don't know. It's weird coming into the cannabis industry, seeing some of the like drama that goes on among the companies and the people, and so much, egos fighting egos that it's weird. It's like being in middle school again sometimes.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that everyone makes it so personal.
Yeah.
But like, it took many persons.
Yeah.
To accomplish that, even if it was one guy who used an old hose in this garden, like that choice affected everyone.
Yep.
And so that means that everyone was responsible for making sure that there wasn't old hoses.
Right, exactly.
Like, yeah, he's the guy who used it, but there was probably 2 or 3 other humans who could have helped prevent it.
Right.
And there was probably a few people down the line who could have done something about it. Like there's ways to work through it. And, pointing the finger at who's at fault is just it's like our first petty instinct.
Yeah.
But it doesn't serve anyone. And that goes for even small issues like getting low yields. I would rather go back to a farmer and say, my yields are poor from this material. Like, let's work on a way to improve this, not say, I'm not going to pay you this much for this material and I'll never do business with you again, which is,
right.
Which is how most people would respond, is they would get upset. They would blame someone. They would say, you're just bad at this. And they expect perfection. It's so much easier to work together and, take someone who gives you low yields into giving you even higher yields than you get from your high yield suppliers, at the same price you started with. These long-term relationships keep us all in business. And I think they're the only things that'll protect us from large financial interests replacing us later, because they will have to do it all themselves. If we don't work together, we're not going to compete.
Yeah. No, I think that is absolutely the case. And, it's cool to see organizations like, from the Future 4200 Forum, the Good Life Gang, to see these companies that are sharing SOPs and, information and trying to create that robust network, that'll hopefully be
Right.
able to survive. That's been really cool to see, and even on the farm side too, we're seeing more and more kind of farms that are trying to find ways to work together and kind of co-op situations, figure out how to um, not necessarily have to fall into that trap of like large monoculture, big ag scale cultivating, be
Right.
able to keep doing things the way they want in a more sustainable way, but work together to provide enough material that, these accounts that want to buy massive amounts at once, they'll still have their, their weight there. But um, I wanted to check in with you for just a minute because we've been going for almost an hour. How are you on time?
Yeah. I'm good for right now.
Cool. Okay, excellent. Well, the next question I wanted to ask you is related to a hashtag that you make a lot about your classes that I'm
Uh-huh.
just probably ignorant and don't know what it means. So I wanted to ask you while I was talking to you. Aquatech, what does that
Sure.
mean?
So aquatech is kind of a marketing term. And basically, it refers to the methodology that we developed, which is a chromatography application using, butane and propane right
Gotcha.
in the column. And so the idea was to perform that, chromatography separation in the original extraction solvent. Although you can apply this to crude oil that's been extracted from almost anything else, it just poses different issues.
Sure.
All which are fun challenges to work through
Right.
for me.
Yeah, exactly. Puzzles.
Yep. But yeah, so the idea there is that using chromatography, we are able to have our liquid phase, our solution, moving through a solid phase of media. And that media is going to separate our solution by polarity, which allows us to extract our terpenes very quickly, very cleanly, get them out of the extractor and away from heat right away. And then we get to pull apart the rest of our solution. And so depending on the column that you build and the media that you use and the parameters that you put in place, we're modeling this after flash chromatography.
Yep, that's what I was
But
thinking.
it allows us to separate, kind of by category first: terpenes, cannabinoids, waxes, and water solubles. So we're able to get extremely high purity crystallization results almost instantly because we've reduced our solution down to simpler parts.
Yeah.
Which is exciting from, an efficiency perspective, because it means even less post-processing
Right.
from,
Exactly.
which, crystallization is already nothing, that's an easy post-process for most people. And, even in the pharmaceutical world, like that's something that we've, got down. But this is just a fantastic shortcut. You're 99% right out of the extractor, almost every time.
Yeah.
But then it also does allow us to pull that terpene content out separately. So it's not interfering with crystallization and also not exposed to some of the same temperatures and conditions that we would potentially expose our cannabinoids to. So that allows me to remove the butane and propane at different temperatures, and under different conditions than it takes for me to remove butane and propane from, that crystalline dry product.
Sure,
so now I get to treat each of these compounds appropriately and bring them back together later. So anything that's Aquatech is a formulated product. It didn't come out of the extractor that way. It came out of the extractor in multiple fractions, and we pulled the best parts out of it, which are subjective. I decided what I liked the best for the most part. It's also based on analytical testing and, where the clean parts of our product are. But in that way, we're able to pull flavonoid content. We're able to pull terpene content. We're able to get high purity cannabinoid content. And then we can deliver it back to the consumer in consistent ratios.
Yep.
So, like when your question earlier of like explain these different textures, a lot of times those textures are based on what came out of the extractor.
Right.
So if I didn't get a lot of terpenes, but I got a lot of cannabinoids, here you go. I've got a whole bunch of dry wax, or I've got really stable shatter. And if I do get a lot of terpenes and I still have a decent amount of cannabinoids, now I've got wet sugar. Now I've got greasy batter. Now I have shatter that won't stabilize, but I'm taking it from the entire other approach, which is get everything out of the plant, pull it into my different jars. Now I have ingredients and I make whatever I want.
Yep.
So I can make stable shatter from there. I can redissolve my THCA content back into butane and propane and pour it out as a slab, or I can whip it up together with some terpenes, or I can crystallize it into diamonds. I can decarb it. And, now I can have Delta 9 and THC.
Yeah.
You know, like I can make whatever I want every single time, and I can still preserve the live resin profile that the plant gave me. But I can make whatever I want every single time, which is an enormous value, because
it's huge.
sometimes you don't get the ratios of things and that you're looking for.
Right.
It's really common to have more THCA content than pairs nicely with terpene content. And so it's great to not just have to dilute the flavor.
Yeah.
You know, I can just pull that THCA aside, put that into Delta 9 and, put it in carts. I can do whatever I want with it and, maintain that profile of the plant with a consistent cannabinoid content, which especially for medical patients is important, because they, are only just now starting to figure out why sativa or indica is too broad of a, category. And so we start telling them to pay attention to these terpenes, but they do also still have to pay attention to the dose. The cannabinoid dose matters.
Yep.
And so if I can provide the same cannabinoid content every time, but different flavors, I can't say that it's good for anything. I'm not allowed to make any health claims.
Right.
But if I'm consistent, then you can figure out what works for you.
Exactly.
And you can take a bigger or a smaller dab. Or you can tell me that ratio is not cool, and I can literally change it.
Right.
I can make whatever I want.
Well, that's really exciting, because I mean, you're talking about making standardized product, which is so needed in the industry. And when I'm doing seminars or teaching folks, I always talk about journaling, as far as when people talk about what'll work for this or that or the other. I'm like, the only way you're going to figure that out is by paying attention to how your body reacts to different things, and journaling's a great way. And one of the limitations that, people are running into with journaling is the inconsistent product formulations. If they prefer extracts, they will usually hone in on maybe just the THC or CBD values, and maybe won't focus too much on other things, or they are paying attention to terpenes and anything else they can get data on, but batch to batch it's just changing.
Right.
So that's really exciting, because that it fixes a variable and can allow people to...
I'm just trying to cut them down.
Right.
We've only got like 300 variables per batch, and
right.
I just want just one fewer if I can make it work. And anecdotal data or journaling is still data. Like all we need to understand it is more data. It is a lot more data, but it's attainable. And so even if every person who smoked wrote down how it made them feel and we fed that to a computer, the algorithm would be accurate.
Yeah.
Like it would tell us what it does.
Right.
So wherever that data comes from, it's extremely valuable. And especially for the people who need it most, write it down. I mean, I can't be expected to remember what temperature I did something at during my extraction. I write it down. You cannot be expected to remember how fast your headache went away when you were high at the time. These are things that we really benefit from if people can write it down. And more data is available than ever before. We go a step above and put terpene content on every single package that we sell. So every single terpene is listed along with I shouldn't say every single terpene we can test for is listed, as well as the ratio. And then all of that's available on our website too. So even if you just write down, I tried this Kush Mints batch this one time, you can go back in time, look on our website and figure out, that Kush Mints had a lot of CBG.
Yeah.
In addition to having a lot of pinene, terpinolene, whatever, you can start to pull all of the pieces of data together. And the more data I get, the more data I'll put out. But I don't have the ability to predict what it's going to do for anyone. I can't say that it's good or bad. I'm relying on the plant itself being ideally safe and giving me, a profile of chemical content that is beneficial. And the only way I'll know is after people provide feedback on that. And so, I believe strongly in my method because it allows me to make changes, and I'm not just stuck with whatever has happened inside of my extraction system, that I can make it work for people, which is really exciting. I mean, I love sweet flavors and good dabs. I love that it's available recreationally, but the medical products that we produce are, generally a disservice to the people who need them most. And so I hope that through this method, we're able to make, the right chemical profiles super cheap for people. I think it sucks that, it's easier for people to get high THC products at a low price, but not 2-to-1 CBD THC products at a low price, I would love to figure out what those ratios are and make those medical products available through our current system rather than forcing the pharmaceutical industry to take on that role.
Yeah, I agree. And the overall just cost of cannabis products generally for medical patients, I'd like to see some states try to fix that problem. It's something that in a lot of the doctors I've interviewed, they bring that issue up, that when I ask them about dosaging, a lot of times, interview I did very recently with a pain physician in North Carolina that's working with patients using CBD. He's like, well, our patients, the ones that are, really in severe chronic pain, a lot of times they're either poor or they're elderly. They don't have a ton of money to spend on, all of
on
these
trial and error, first of all,
exactly.
let alone just the regular cost of these products.
Yeah, exactly. And so
usually they can afford to try it once, and if they don't get the results they're looking for, they give up on it.
Exactly. Yeah. That's something that's been on my mind, is how many people have given up quickly, especially. So now we can loop back around to talk about the CBD industry, because that's where right now I see this like really highlighted, with so many people flocking to buy CBD products, and they're all over the board as far as quality and potency and pricing, with some of them extremely expensive. And you've got these people trying to treat very severe medical conditions that are spending $150, $200 on a 1-ounce bottle of a CBD tincture that may have like 300 or 500 milligrams in the whole bottle. It's really fascinating. I did want to actually come back around. You mentioned some of your thoughts about quality issues related to the CBD industry and the extractions going to CBD. So do you mind talking about that? What is unique about what's going on in the CBD industry, and what has you a little concerned?
Yeah, so the hemp world is extremely unique, and it's very strange. Because in the traditional, medical marijuana recreational markets, it's all, these are all state programs, right? So of course they vary, because the states vary. A lot of these states have home rule, which means that not only the state rules are in effect, but also every municipality can do whatever they want. And so you see, in that licensed structure, a huge range of requirements, from the safety and architecture of the building all the way out to the solvents that are allowed to be used, and what is required to be tested for and what isn't. So the regulations are all over the place within that framework. In the CBD world, it's kind of this like extreme polar opposite land where we have some actual federal regulations in place. We have truly GMP, USDA, certified facilities that are manufacturing pharmaceutically pure compounds, start to finish. And then you have literally anyone, anywhere in the world, making a bath bomb in their living room and selling it as medicine, to whoever will buy it. Like there's, so that, that spectrum is absolutely insane, because there's not enforcement on anyone except the people who are doing perfect things.
Yeah.
And the people who are doing the perfect pharmaceutically pure compounds, those are all going to formulations, and, a lot of times there's like white labeling, or they're just selling a bulk product. And so, it doesn't mean that small businesses aren't, having access to that level of purity necessarily, but there's just no chain of custody monitoring whatsoever. And so, it's a really scary place to be. I've gotten about a dozen messages today already, because we have our first potential confirmed CBD death.
I saw that.
I don't know if you read about that. So we have no data about that. I don't even want to make any, comments, because I haven't been able to read enough about what was being referenced in there, but it's not surprising at all that drug interactions
Right.
would be our first, actual
Yep.
cannabinoid induced death, because drug interactions are known, and when we break
Mm-hmm.
it down, it's all just chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
So this one company that made this one product is going to burn alive probably,
Yeah. Yeah.
over this issue. But
Affects everyone.
it affects everyone, and it doesn't mean that they're the only ones who are creating a product that could cause this, much like the vape, crisis
Mm-hmm.
of 2019. Like,
Yeah.
even now, we still don't know
Yeah.
that vitamin E acetate caused the death. We
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
know that it was in all of their lungs. And not even all of them, just most,
Mm-hmm.
like we still don't have
Yeah. That
explanations.
common factor has still not really
Yeah.
been identified.
Right. So we get more data and more data and more data, but we still don't have a complete picture.
Yeah.
We're still missing huge pieces in our puzzle. We just have to keep working forward on it. And so the CBD world is in a unique position to innovate faster
Yeah.
because they don't have the same regulations that we do. They also are in a position to infiltrate the public domain faster and influence the public's opinion of how cannabinoids are bought and sold,
Yeah.
which is exciting in a lot of ways. People make fun of gas station CBD, but I think that if we're going to sell cigarettes at a gas station, if we're
Right.
going to sell
Yeah.
liquor at a gas station, if we're going to sell sugar and
Yep.
caffeine at a gas station, sure, we should be able to sell weed at a gas station. Why
Mm-hmm.
not? All
Yeah.
cannabinoids should be able to be sold at a gas station if one of them can. So I appreciate the way that some of that underground CBD pushes the boundaries,
Yeah.
in those, very honestly political ways,
Mm-hmm.
because it does, give me hope about a future where I can still make a craft concentrate that people can buy.
Yeah.
Because the other end of that spectrum, where they're making 99.999% pure compounds and formulating them back into, a gel cap or whatever, is boring. That's not what I, like,
Mm-hmm.
it's very cool to build, and then I don't want that factory job. I want to keep innovating new things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, that pharmaceutical world should exist, but I want to see both. And
Mm-hmm.
the things that happen in between those two that are dangerous jeopardize all of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
Exactly.
really unfortunate, because only those big ones have the potential to survive that FDA world. But if we
Mm-hmm.
don't have the market to support them, then they all go out of business. And we're watching that happen this year in the hemp industry.
Yeah.
We're seeing some of the biggest players who had the most money
Yep.
and the biggest extractors and just millions of dollars in infrastructure right now that aren't gonna do, they
Yeah.
probably won't even plant.
Yep.
And so that isn't encouraging for our industry. I don't want to see the money fall out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been wild the past year seeing how many big names are folding or going under a change of ownership,
Right.
trying to totally restructure to stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
It's been really, really bizarre. And yeah, that CBD death, I just saw that several hours ago, or sometime
Right.
this morning. Um, it's one of those things that those of us that have kind of studied cannabinoids and particularly CBD for a while, we've all known that, like, yeah, the grapefruit effect, is a thing with CBD, and CBD seems to exhibit a higher potency than even grapefruit does, and having that effect. And it's one of those things that the market seems to be too far ahead of where like the medical establishment is. That, like, a lot of doctors don't know that, a lot of nurses
Right.
don't know that, and I feel like if they did, they would probably inquire more about whether patients are using CBD, when they're
Mm-hmm.
on other drugs, that sort of thing. And it's one of these risks that could be mitigated with education and proper involvement between the patient and doctor relationship and that sort of thing. um, but it's also one of these things that, like you're alluding to, that um, something wrong can happen and it's going to affect the entire industry in major ways. If people start dying from drug interactions from CBD, and then you have new regulations that come in that affect how cannabinoids can exist on the marketplace, or and then that's going to affect all of these other companies, all over a risk that could be mitigated,
Yeah.
Just with proper education and oversight
Right.
and recognition of something's own risks and limitations. I feel like the cannabis industry, and particularly with CBD right now, it's an interesting place because people really don't like talking about risk at all. Like, they don't want
Yeah.
to acknowledge that cannabis has any negative, potential. And it's
Yeah.
something that as an industry, we've really got to get over, because it's going to keep causing problems, and it makes the industry look bad if you can't acknowledge, the relatively few, risks that actually exist with cannabis compared to a lot of other natural products.
Right. Like, safe is a spectrum,
Yeah.
and poison is in the dose.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so we can't pretend that cannabis is the exception to, like, the most common fundamental rule of what we put in our bodies.
Yeah.
Like, it matters how much, and it matters what.
Yep.
And I don't like, obviously I don't like to see anyone die from, anything preventable, let alone from cannabis, but I don't like to to open ourselves up to, demonizing, the word cannabis represents 400 different potential active ingredients. And
Yeah.
we can't say, oh, well, now CBD is bad, or, oh, well, now just CBD tinctures is bad, or just CBD over 200 milligrams a day. We can't generalize it, but we can specialize. We can say these drug interaction issues were known. And, all you have to do is, talk to your doctor, or at least research, the drugs that you're using. If more people, like you said, just knew the grapefruit, like, it's such a simple thing to communicate that says, if your drug says that you cannot consume grapefruit and citrus, you should avoid cannabinoids as well. Like, proliferating that is something that would be extremely important information for all of the prescribing doctors who write medical recommendations, because I bet there's a large portion of them that aren't, keeping up on that data. Not to mention every single bud tender, because they're not medical professionals, but every single one of them is making recommendations every single day about dose. And we don't have any good data to support what is safe and what isn't. So I hope that this brings the right attention to those issues, because it's easier to abuse a product that's more readily accessible, right? But we really need to address what that abuse looks like before it just all gets taken away.
Yeah. So, yeah, it relates to another idea that came up in one of my really early interviews about, like, what does responsible cannabis use look like, and trying to, like, have that discussion, and, like, being able to have, like, an elevator pitch kind of response to that. Like, what does that look like, especially as, legalization progresses and people, are able to have more open, honest conversations with adolescents and young kids and stuff about, cannabis. Like, how do we talk about the risks in a mature, honest way? How do we talk about responsible use in a mature, honest way? And, and going back to this theme that keeps coming up of, being able to just make the industry better, increase, support public health and safety, and just overall as a society, just be better, and handle these things in a more mindful way.
It's something I think about constantly, because I have, a 2-year-old now.
Yeah.
So
I have a 1-year-old.
Yeah. So it's something I think about a lot, because, my parents never consumed any cannabis in their lives to this day. And so it was easy for them to say, abstain, like, even if they were wrong about saying it was unsafe, like, they were in a position to just, not use. Whereas, I'm going to be in a completely different position when I talk to my son about it, because I'm going to have to justify my use, at a minimum, let alone, be able to justify my recommendations on his. And I have no idea what that's going to be.
Yeah.
Because I don't even know, like, by the time he gets exposed to cannabis, we might not even be smoking flower anymore.
Right.
You know what
I
I mean?
know.
Like we
Yeah.
might just like download it into
Right.
our like AirPod, you know, like I have no idea what cannabis consumption is going to look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now,
Yeah.
because
It's
I
changed.
never would have predicted my life today, you know, in
Mm-hmm.
2009 when I, you know, walked into a dispensary for the first
Yep.
time, you
Yep.
know, like I was still impressed by, you know, giant volcano vaporizer
Yeah.
bags back
Yep.
then, you
Yep.
know,
Me
like
too. Yep.
the world is different. And
Yeah.
so, you know, how I communicate that is something I think about a lot, because I educate adults.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes with the social contract of, I'm not responsible for you.
Right.
I'm going to tell
right.
you what I
Yep.
know, and you're going to interpret it
Yep.
and apply it to your own life, but I'm not responsible for your choices. But I am responsible for my son's choices, you know, and I am responsible for, you know, the way he makes those decisions. And so I hope that education is something that, you know, we can follow, you know, really hard. You know, like it was great to get rid of a lot of the dare, you know, scare tactic type of, you know, fear mongering, but we can't just leave it at that.
Yeah.
You know, we have to replace it with
Yep.
something valuable. If it turns out that, you know, all of these jewels are more dangerous than cigarettes, you know, then like telling kids not to smoke cigarettes and not being
Right.
prepared to respond to the vaporizer situation, you know, was an epic failure.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we're in that same position with cannabis. You know, like edibles are crazy today. And I do not think kids should be going around eating dispensary edibles.
Yeah.
You know, they'll you know, I think that they don't have a good understanding of what that dose looks like.
Yeah.
Whereas I at least did have you know, the social knowledge of knowing the difference between drinking a whole bottle of beer versus a whole bottle of
Right.
tequila, you know, at
Yeah.
14 or at 16 or whatever. But with cannabis, we don't communicate that very well, and we might put the milligrams on the package, but that doesn't mean anything
Right.
to anyone.
If you have no context.
Ibuprofen is 200 milligrams per dose, so yeah, 200 milligrams of THC, right? Why not? Like, we don't have any perspective that we provide to consumers, let alone the unintended potential consumers. So I really hope that the cannabis industry will uphold you know, its original vows, you know, to take care of medical patients through that education. The more we learn about cannabis, the better those recommendations can be, and you know, we can explain these risks and hopefully prevent them, you know, in the future.
Does Colorado have potency limits on edibles?
So there's limits per package. It's 100 milligrams per package, and the recommended dose is 10 milligrams per piece. So whatever your edible product is, it has to be easily identified as what 10 milligrams would represent. So that either means like 10 pieces in a
segmented
package,
or whatever.
you have to be able to break it up, or notches on the drink that tell you how far to drink it down. You know, something that makes it easy, I guess, to figure out how much you've consumed at once.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because even 10 milligrams to like someone that is new to cannabis edibles or cannabis in general. I know people that have consumed 5 milligrams and started to have overwhelming experiences. So that context that you were talking about is so important. And yeah, edibles in general, it's so hard to get, I don't know, predictable effects from them, depending on what you're eating, how they're made, what the dose is, and like
your metabolism,
exactly what you've eaten during that day and how that's going to affect it. And you know, it's something like a drink. I had some friends that were working in testing labs that were working on trying to understand issues specifically related to drinks. But one of the things I saw recently is that the liner inside of aluminum cans and things actually are lipophilic, and cannabinoids will gather into them over time. So the potency of the drink will change over time and will lower, which is fascinating. And then I know there's another issue with drinks that, you know, depending on the pH, they're seeing some interesting conversions in some of the like THC infused sodas. So
see
it
that.
just adds another layer of complexity to the edible market. Um,
Right.
that I don't know. I really like the idea of these formulated extracts, standardized. It also makes me wonder if, you know, having a product like that you could standardize and that you could define chemically, that you could say this has, this much of sort of the terpene class, and of that class there are these variations, and this percent concentration of the cannabinoid class and these variations, that
Right.
then researchers might be able to take something like that in the future and actually be able to start to do some more interesting research with products that are more akin to what people are actually using in the
Right.
in the actual market, and understand how people react. And because that's several clinicians that I've spoken with have mentioned that, like, that's one of the big drawbacks of them wanting to push forward on some interesting clinical trial work, is there's like, where's the standardized product?
Yeah. How do you get it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that's always been really difficult for me, is that, like, I want to make good products. I want to sell safe medicine.
Yeah.
I want to feel good about everything that I'm making, but we're just relying on the plant to give us those chemicals.
Yeah.
We're just relying on
It's a carrier.
cannabis being great and
Yeah.
that being good enough. And that isn't good enough for literally any other type of extraction.
Yeah.
That isn't good enough for any other type of product. Like, you always have to, consider all of those factors. And so, when we're trying to sell something that has dozens of active ingredients in a final product, at concentrated doses, compared to what they were originally delivered in, if you were to just consume raw flower, I feel like there's a lot of responsibility there that I don't even have the data to back up. Like, I can't say that more pinene is better,
right,
or worse, or safe. I can say I like it,
right.
like, but that doesn't help anyone else, and that doesn't, that doesn't give me, a standard to work from necessarily, which is what we need if we want to, improve that data. And so, one thing I'm really excited about is being able to now track through different harvests, and even just age of material, how that profile changes. Because if I'm extracting it the same way, and I'm starting to see variations from the same producer, now we can actually take that data back even further and say, what did you do on these plants that you didn't do on those plants? Like, now we can, like, I can do a better job extracting in the lab. That's great. But I could influence the decisions that help them be a better grower. Like, I'm expected to, test my product at every step in my process to make sure it's getting pure. But do the growers go and test their bud every single week to see what it's growing, to see if that terpene profile is developing, to see if it's all limonene or if it's going to get better? Like, we don't hold them to the same analytical standards, but we could.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that would make it easier for me. So that'd be great. But it would make it better for the consumer, because they could be more consistent if they knew the impact that, their behaviors had chemically on what I'm able to extract later.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately it creates like a win-win-win situation, because the farmer would just get better. It would help you with your process to be able to make standardized materials more easily, more efficiently. And the consumer would be, sort of have this itch scratch that's been there for so long, of just like, I just want to be able to get the same thing, every time I go to the dispensary.
Most people don't like change. Yeah. Most people want it to be the same. And that's the only thing I can't give you. I can't give you, unless you want just THCA or just CBD, I can't make it the same. So that feedback is invaluable, both from the consumer and to the garden.
Yeah, totally. Well, to start to wrap things up here, there's like two sort of broad questions that I'll ask you. One is, what are some of the most prevalent misconceptions about either cannabis or cannabis extraction or extracts themselves that you encounter most frequently?
I mean, I think you brought up the solvent scare already, which is probably one of the most common ones, is that people look at solvent extracted concentrates as being dangerous. And I would agree that most of them are dangerous to do, the operation definitely requires skill, equipment, and, safety protocols to keep everyone safe. But generally they're safe to consume. However, I think that the exact opposite is also true. One of the greatest misconceptions is that cannabis is inherently safe. And I would argue that cannabis is only as safe as the people who are growing and manufacturing it. Cannabis is not a wild product anymore. It's not Mother Nature.
Yeah.
And it doesn't love us. It is a plant that's being grown mostly for profit by people, and people, you got to choose who you trust. And so, cannabis is only as safe as the people who've produced it. And the absolute same is true with concentrates. They are only as safe as the manufacturer who processed them and packaged them and delivered them to you. And from there, they're only as safe as the person who's storing and consuming them.
Yep.
And so, the misconception that cannabis is ultimately safe is, I think, potentially a dangerous one. We really want to pay attention to what we're doing with this plant, because we keep doing new and exciting stuff, and we keep discovering new things. And it's not uncommon in science in general for us to be wrong.
Right.
And, there are parts of cannabis that can be very dangerous, and there are parts of cannabis concentrates that can be very dangerous. And, I think that those, it's not something that we should be afraid of, but it's something that we should absolutely be educated about.
Yeah.
And no one's going to look for that education if we all operate under the impression that it is blanket safe.
Yeah.
Fire is safe if you don't touch it.
Right. Exactly.
We gotta, we have to, consider those, benefits and risks at all times.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely been refreshing talking to you and hearing the balanced way, that you approach all of this, being willing to acknowledge the downsides and risks, as well as the awesome potential and upsides, and just being very real about, acknowledging all of that. And I really enjoy hearing your perspective of, that ultimately it's better for all of us if we can talk through these things, talk through our conflicts, try to work forward, and ultimately, all be the better for it. So thanks for being willing to come on and share that perspective, and all the great information that you've shared in the past. We've gone for almost an hour and a half. So I really appreciate it.
Of course. No, thank you for having me. I always enjoy, talking about cannabis and concentrates, and, especially to, in a way that'll educate some other people, and hopefully,
I think this will be
start some conversations they might not have otherwise had.
Oh yeah. That's exactly my hope with the podcast in general, is like, hopefully, the things that, the conversations we have, hopefully it stirs other conversations, and just helps drive things in a good direction. I want to make sure to give you, the last couple minutes here. Pretty much, you have the platform. Let people know how to find information about you or your classes or anything else that you want to share or promote. Feel free.
Yeah, absolutely. I teach public classes twice a month at my lab and at other labs across the country and soon to be world. And so depending on where you're at, there's a lot of different opportunities to get in touch with me. But you can always find out what's happening through my Instagram. You can also keep up on my brand, Sano Gardens, the products that we're making. We, of course, specialize in live resin and have vape cartridges and high purity extracts that are all available in Colorado, and that's sanogardens.com or Sano Gardens on Instagram. We also have a full service consulting team behind Sano Gardens, and that's through Nicola Consulting. And so we can help you with designing your lab, improving efficiencies with your equipment, as well as partnering on product development. Our goal is to see more high quality products on the market, whether that means that we help you produce them on your own or we work together to produce them as a team. We believe in elevating the space. So whatever we could do to help other people become better. And you also mentioned, Future 4200, the forum, and the Good Life Gang. I cannot recommend it enough. The Good Life Gang is a great place to find a new mentor. And that's a membership program that gives you access, obviously, to discounts as well as to all of our meetups across the country. If you're not involved in the cannabis industry and want to get involved, it's a great way to meet the right people first and find the mentors and the people who can help you land in the good, safe places, and the find people who share the values that you do. So goodlifegang.tech, check it out.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that's great. Well, yeah, once again, thanks so much for giving me so much of your time and energy. I really, really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, totally. So if you want to learn more about Curious About Cannabis, you can check us out at cacpodcast.com. We're also on social media, primarily on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as YouTube. So check us out there. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening. Take it easy. Bye-bye.